On October 6, 1973, a coalition of Arab countries led by Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. The resulting Yom Kippur War lasted only 20 days, but tens of thousands were killed and many more were wounded. The fallout from this war was felt around the world, thanks to the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. OPEC is widely considered to be the textbook example of a cartel. Between their members in 1973, they owned almost 80% of the world's proven oil reserves. With such a large monopoly, they were able to drastically influence the global price of oil. For the better part of the 20th century, keeping oil prices low was in their best interest. More often than not, the cost for a country to develop their own domestic oil industries was greater than just buying cheap oil from OPEC countries. OPEC was selling oil to everyone they could, and in turn, the world got very used to cheap oil. But OPEC knew that their monopoly didn't just give them financial influence. They could use that influence politically as well. Right after the Yom Kippur War ended, the Arab members of OPEC wielded their oil monopoly as a weapon of retaliation against supporters of Israel. They announced that they would be implementing a complete oil embargo against all countries that had supported Israel during the war. That list included countries like Japan, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States. Just 3 months into the embargo, the global price of oil skyrocketed, and the Western world was in a full-blown crisis. The days of cheap oil were over. The 70s were not going to be an easy time for Canada. Pierre Trudeau and his Liberal government knew they would need to reshape how the entire Canadian energy market was designed to better prepare Canada to deal with crises like this in the future. The oil crisis of 1973 forced not just Canada, but governments around the world to completely rethink their domestic energy policies. When things were going well, it had been cheaper to just import oil from OPEC countries. But geopolitical conflicts in those areas could lead to massive supply chain disruptions when things weren't so good. It had suddenly become clear to countries like Canada and the United States that while domestic energy sources might be more expensive to develop, investing in those areas would act as a sort of buffer to isolate them from the impacts they were now facing. Canada didn't just get into this situation through sheer negligence. Canadian dependence on OPEC oil was a strategic decision more than 25 years in the making, and in many ways, it started in Alberta in 1947. Let's start a graph. On the outer edge of this clock will be the daily output of barrels of oil produced in Alberta. 1947 was the year of the major oil discovery in Leduc, which was transformational for Alberta and Canada as a whole. In many ways, it was the start of Alberta's modern oil industry. In that year alone, just over 17,000 barrels of conventional oil were produced in Alberta every day. The oil sands, on the other hand, would take decades more to reach those kinds of production levels, but we'll come back to that later. After 1947, conventional oil production was growing astronomically year over year, and Alberta's market quickly grew saturated by their own supply. This was not only an economic opportunity if Alberta could start selling to new markets, but it was an opportunity for Canada to strengthen its own domestic energy production. However, it's a huge logistical challenge to get that oil and natural gas from the landlocked prairies to the rest of Canada. The cheapest and most controversial way of doing this would be by building pipelines. This was something that Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent's government had been looking to address since the start of the 1950s. Minister of Everything C.D. Howe believed that connecting Western energy to Eastern markets was one of the most important nation-building projects of the time, on par with the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway from the 1880s that connected Eastern and Western Canada. But to connect the entire country, they were going to need to lay a lot of pipe. On the western front, the path to the Pacific Ocean is separated by the Rocky Mountains, making this a challenging route, but not an impossible one. The Trans Mountain Pipeline between Edmonton and Vancouver was built in 1952 and opened the following year. This not only opened up BC's market to Alberta, but made it easier to sell to the Western United States and Asia. But getting oil to Eastern Canada was of the utmost importance for Canadian energy security. About half of all Canadians live in the corridor between Windsor, Ontario and Quebec City, Quebec. Not only would a pipeline from Alberta to the corridor allow Canada to meet its own energy needs, it would strengthen economic ties between the prairies and the eastern provinces. Regional economies in eastern Canada like Ontario and Quebec were more and more becoming centered around manufacturing, which required cheap and reliable energy sources to be powered. With a pipeline connecting the two areas, economic success in eastern Canada would translate to economic success in Alberta, and vice versa. To that end, in 1949, Imperial Oil created a subsidiary called the Interprovincial Pipeline Company, known better today as Enbridge. In 1950, Enbridge built a pipeline connecting Edmonton to the western shore of Lake Superior in Wisconsin, where oil was initially shipped by boat through the Great Lakes and processed in Sarnia, Ontario. Extensions in 1953 and 1958 brought this pipeline all the way to Toronto, completing the first stage of their expansion into eastern Canada. Private industry built the first major oil pipeline to eastern Canada on their own out of financial necessity. But the federal government recognized a critical transition taking place in the minds of the public when it came to energy. More and more, cheap fuel was becoming an expectation for most people. Even in the 1950s, the federal government recognized the vast benefits cheap fuel provided the country. This led the feds to become directly involved in the construction of the first national pipeline for natural gas. Under the ever-watchful eye of C.D. Howe, Trans-Canada Pipelines was created, with the goal to build a natural gas pipeline from Alberta to eastern Canada. Surprisingly, Trans-Canada was not formed as a Crown corporation, seemingly a missed opportunity for the Minister of Everything to add to his roster of Crown Corps. Rather, Trans-Canada was established as a private enterprise. But problematically, and confusingly, this company was majority financed by American interests. I've got to say, this is one of the strangest origins for a company I've ever heard of. It was created by an act of parliament to build strategically important energy infrastructure, but ends up as a private company financed by foreign interests instead of as a Crown corporation? Like, what? Federal opposition parties strongly objected to this project. They were concerned that the heavy involvement of American financing would subject Trans-Canada and their pipeline assets to American control at a later date and compromise Canadian access to their own natural gas. Seems like a fair concern. To address these concerns, St. Laurent's Liberals had opted for a more expensive route for the pipeline entirely through Canada over the cheaper route that followed a similar path to Enbridge's oil pipeline. Parliamentary debates over Trans-Canada's pipeline dragged on, threatening to cause the project to miss key financing deadlines. So, St. Laurent's government ended up shutting down the debate on the pipeline and forcing a vote through a rarely used House procedure called closure. The pipeline was approved, but the use of closure, which had not been used once in the past 24 years, upset a lot of people. This may not seem like such a big deal in a modern context, but this actually turned into a huge scandal for St. Laurent and contributed heavily to his loss to John Diefenbaker in 1957. With the project approved, the Trans-Canada Pipeline was completed in 1958 to transport natural gas from Alberta to Ontario and Quebec. It was the longest pipeline in the world at the time, clocking in at 3,700 kilometers. By the end of the 50s, Alberta was connected to Montreal and Toronto for natural gas through the Trans-Canada Pipeline, but only as far as Toronto through the Enbridge oil pipeline. It seemed like the majority of the work to connect the country via pipe was over. But extending the oil pipeline from Ontario to Quebec turned out to be a whole other challenge. This was a critical last step to fully connect the eastern and western Canadian oil markets. But as it turned out, Quebec wasn't really interested in an oil pipeline in the first place. Montreal at the time held about a third of the country's refinery capacity, and would likely end up as a hub for refining any crude oil from Alberta that made its way that far east. But even when transporting it by pipeline in the cheapest way possible, Alberta oil was still more expensive than OPEC oil shipped in through the St. Lawrence River. Quebec refineries worried that if forced into accepting Alberta oil, they would become uncompetitive with American refiners who still imported cheap oil from OPEC. At the same time, American interests at the highest levels were keeping a close eye on Canada's energy policy debate. President Eisenhower's National Security Council came to the conclusion that if Canada built an oil pipeline connecting Alberta all the way to Quebec, eastern Canada's market would eventually close to OPEC countries completely. In turn, OPEC could end up blaming the US for a lack of action, leading to a loss of business and retaliating economically against the US. Not outside of the realm of possibility, as time would show. Instead, if the US were to open more of their market to Alberta oil, Alberta would have a market to sell their excess supply to, and Eastern Canada would remain OPEC territory. So, that's exactly what they did. Diefenbaker's government had established a commission to study whether Canada should build a pipeline connecting Alberta to Montreal. But they were persuaded by American oil consultants to instead divert excess Alberta oil to the US. In turn, the US would remove all existing import limits on Canadian oil. The federal government accepted this proposal, which was the basis for the creation of the National Oil Policy in 1961. The National Oil Policy officially split Canada along the Ontario-Quebec border into two distinct oil markets. Western provinces would supply the western market for crude oil, while Quebec and the Atlantic provinces would continue to import cheap oil by ship from OPEC countries. Canada would not extend the Enbridge oil pipeline into Eastern Canada, and would instead open the door for Alberta to expand their market by sending their oil south to the United States. It was a system largely designed to meet the needs of the market, namely the American market, and it set the stage for a national crisis in Canada. Let's focus back on the oil sands. Alberta had spent the nearly 50 years after World War I trying to turn extraction and separation of bitumen from the oil sands into a profitable business. The federal government tried with Abasand to bring the oil sands online as part of the war effort in the 40s. When that failed, the provincial government of Alberta tried on their own to show the world that the oil sands could be developed profitably. In the early 50s, they claimed they'd done it, but experts from the conventional oil industry did their own assessment and disagreed, and the plant closed down shortly after. Out of the ashes of these initial developments came another company looking to make their name from the oil sands, figuratively and literally. Remember Oil Sands Limited? After Lloyd Champion bought Fitzsimmons out from Bitumen and International Bitumen, he also changed the company's name to Oil Sands Limited. When Champion failed to meet his financial obligations in his partnership with the province of Alberta, he was kicked out of Bitumen but retained his company. After licking his wounds and a soft rebrand, his company was looking to make a comeback as Great Canadian Oil Sands Limited. But their patriotic prefix quickly became no more than a namesake. Pennsylvania's Sun Oils, known today as Sunoco, purchased a majority stake in the company and became its owner in 1963. Given Great Canadian's history, this was probably a questionable business decision, but the man behind the decision had big plans for Alberta. Sun Oil's president J. Howard Pugh was a devout Presbyterian and a man of conviction. An extremely wealthy oil baron like his father before him, Pugh had taken a personal interest in the oil sands back in World War II. A whole 30 years before the Yom Kippur War, he recognized that the development of synthetic fuels could help reduce North American dependence on imported conventional oil from politically unstable places like Venezuela or the Persian Gulf. Even though the business case for the oil sands was unproven, Pugh threw his company headfirst into their development. Because of their strategic importance, Pugh believed that the challenges facing the oil sands were a risk his company should be willing to shoulder. Risks that up until then, no company, Canadian, American, or otherwise, had been willing to accept. Through Great Canadian Oil Sands, Sun Oil barreled through with the construction of a mining, separating, and upgrading facility near Fort McMurray. Throughout the 1960s, Sun Oil spent a staggering $250 million on the oil sands. This was the largest private investment in Canadian history at the time, and quite possibly, it was the largest gamble in Canadian history as well. This was the very first operation of its kind. There were no blueprints, no directions on how to run this kind of business. It was the birth of a completely new kind of industry. For many, this was an achievement worth celebrating. The opening of the Great Canadian Oil Sands facility in 1967 was a significant moment for Alberta. More than 50 years of research and business development had finally accumulated in the first commercial facility to unlock the wealth buried in the sand in northern Alberta. Sidney Ells was invited to the opening ceremony as a distinguished guest for his role as a pioneer of the new industry. Sadly, Karl had passed away just 1 year prior to its official opening. The ceremony was in part a celebration of everyone who contributed to the success of the project, but in another way, it was a sermon preaching manifest destiny. As an example, take a look at the standard logo of the Great Canadian Oil Sands. It represents a bucket wheel like those that the company would eventually use to excavate the oil sands. At the inauguration ceremony for the plant, this logo was encircled by the company name along with 4 foreboding words. Man develops his world. As though God himself was directly commanding J. Howard Pugh to transform northern Alberta into a place of industry.
At the outset of this undertaking, I told our stockholders that unless projects of this character were periodically challenged and solved, our organization would become soft and eventually useless. My associates have conceived and built this magnificent plant. So I trust that they may now take comfort in the knowledge that they are not soft and that they continue to be most useful.
Sun Oil under Pugh was the first oil company to forge ahead into the oil sands on an industrial scale, with a plant capable of processing up to 45,000 barrels per day. But Sun Oil was not alone for long. Of course, there were other oil companies interested in developing the oil sands. Sun Oil was just the only one willing to risk investing hundreds of millions of dollars without knowing for sure what their return would look like. Several other companies with lower risk tolerances were curious about the sands, such as Citgo, Gulf Oil, Imperial Oil, and even good old Richfield Oil. By this point, Richfield had merged with Atlantic Petroleum as Atlantic Richfield, but they hadn't fully forgotten about northern Alberta after their plan to nuke the oil sands had turned to dust. These 4 companies decided to enter a joint venture to build a mining and separation plant under the name of Syncrude, short for synthetic crude. Syncrude incorporated in the 1960s and submitted a proposal for a plant capable of producing 80,000 barrels per day, almost double what Great Canadian had proposed. After receiving approval from the Alberta government in the early 70s, construction on Syncrude's facility began in 1973. Big changes were afoot for Alberta in the 1970s. Alberta had also kicked the decade off with the start of a new provincial dynasty. In 1971, Peter Lougheed's Progressive Conservative Party took power in Alberta, ending the 36-year reign of Alberta's other major right-wing political party, the Social Credits. The majority of those 36 years were under the premiership of Ernest Manning. When it came to the oil sands, under Manning, Alberta's government had been patient and supportive of the long timelines required by oil sand development projects. This was an approach learned through decades of experience and failures. It was an approach that Lougheed was immediately ready to throw out the window. In general, Lougheed was very skeptical of the oil companies in Alberta, and rightfully so for one absolutely critical reason. Although it may seem like oil companies' interests largely overlap with Albertans' interests, this was not the case and is not the case. At any moment, they could close shop and take their business wherever the industrial climate was better. Alberta is only useful to oil companies as long as they're entitled to Alberta's oil cheaper than anywhere else they could get it from. Shortly after being elected, Lougheed raised the royalty rates on conventional oil producers in the province, and signaled that Alberta's government would have much higher expectations for the industry from now on. Under Lougheed, companies would receive less handouts from the government and would be expected to pay their fair share of taxes. Despite the slew of problems Great Canadian was having, Lougheed's government wanted more than just royalties from the industry. From Lougheed's perspective, it was a lack of motivation from the oil companies that was slowing down the number of developments in the sands. From his perspective, there was no reason why another 10 to 20 oil sand projects couldn't be built within the next 5 years. And if there's one thing that really gets industry motivated, it's arbitrary targets by new governments with no institutional knowledge. When the price of oil around the world shot up after the Yom Kippur War, Canada was faced with a crisis that demanded a response all the way from the top of the federal government. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was forced to take action. Trudeau Sr. was a charismatic but controversial head of government for Canada. Pierre Trudeau has been described as a federalist and an economic nationalist. During his tenure, his Liberal government took centralized control of the country's levers of power and enacted several social and economic policies that made him popular with a lot of people, but very unpopular with many more, particularly out west. Not that this ever really bothered him. For Pierre Trudeau, the ends almost always justified the means. Perhaps most characteristic of this attitude was during the October crisis in 1970, when a group of terrorists kidnapped and eventually killed a hostage in Montreal in the name of Quebec separatism. At the height of the conflict, Trudeau was famously asked by a reporter how far he was willing to go in suspending civil liberties to resolve the crisis. His response? Well, just watch me. For most of the 1970s, Alberta was left watching Trudeau a lot. Not over the suspension of civil liberties due to terrorist attacks, but as his government worked to exert jurisdictional control over the provinces. The energy crisis only exacerbated the growing resentment between Ottawa and Alberta over oil. The surge in global oil prices required immediate action from the feds, since the Eastern Canadian market was completely dependent on OPEC oil. The first move for Trudeau's government was to freeze domestic oil prices for consumers across the country. This meant no matter the global price of oil, Canadians wouldn't be paying substantially higher prices for gas at the pump. This was a tall order to achieve, and the government was going to finance this in two ways. The first was with an increase to taxes on oil exports going to the United States. The second way this was done was by getting domestic producers to sell oil in Canada at about half the price it would be fetching on the global market. This would ensure Canadian access to cheaper oil in the short term. But price freezes and tax increases would only do so much for so long. With band-aids on their bullet holes, the feds had to start planning their long-term solutions to the crisis at hand. Trudeau was presented with a surprisingly appealing idea coming from the opposition New Democratic Party. Trudeau's Liberals had won the 1972 election, but had been a couple dozen seats away from winning a majority. For most of that term, they relied on the NDP's support to stay in power. That sounds familiar. In the wake of the oil crisis, the NDP were proposing that the government set up a crown corporation in the petroleum industry to give the government more direct control and influence over oil in Canada. The sentiment was that Canada's petroleum industry had been geared towards extracting Canadian resources for the profit of American companies. A federally owned petroleum company would provide a relatively direct way for Canadians to benefit from those profits as well. Here's how former NDP leader and father of Canada's universal healthcare model Tommy Douglas put it.
Any industry which controls the energy resources of a nation has its fingers on the windpipe of that nation's economy. And unless in this country the people, through their governments, federally and provincially, get some control of the petroleum industry, we are going to go through in the next 25 years what we've gone through in the last 25 years when we've watched the petroleum industry, foreknown and controlled, defying the interests of the Canadian people and blackmailing the Canadian governments.
This Crown Corp would help secure oil supplies, give the government more direct knowledge over the oil industry, something the feds had been lacking for decades, and provide a more direct path for government revenue collection from oil production. Initially, the Liberals were against the idea of a Crown-owned oil company, but with pressure from the NDP, the motion was passed and Petro-Canada was born. The creation of Petro-Canada is a textbook example of how, even though the NDP have never won a federal election, they have managed to stay relevant and enact change in Canadian politics. Don't tell JJ McCauley I said that, though. The economic argument for Petro-Canada was convincing, but there was another aspect to the creation of Petro-Canada that appealed to Trudeau: nationalism. The oil shock was the first time since the start of the Cold War that Canada was forced to think strategically about its own needs and acted independently of its relationship with the US. The oil crisis was a key turning point for a rise in Canadian nationalism and a general distrust for American influence in Canadian affairs, particularly when it came to oil. The petroleum industry in Canada was overwhelmingly foreign-owned, mostly by American companies. At the beginning of the 1970s, more than 3/4 of foreign investment in Canada was coming from the United States. Just like with the pipeline debate under St. Laurent, Trudeau's federal government was concerned that Canada's energy industry was shaping up to supply American energy needs before its own. In order to put Canadian interests first, the feds would need to put in place a comprehensive plan to do that. In December of 1973, Trudeau's formal response to the oil crisis came in the form of a national energy policy, which was designed to reach Canadian self-sufficiency in oil and oil products by the end of the decade. To that end, several measures were announced. In addition to the creation of Petro-Canada, corporate income tax for oil producers would be increased. The Enbridge oil pipeline, which currently ended in Toronto, would be extended all the way to Montreal, finally connecting the two disjointed Canadian oil markets. Oil exports to the US would be slashed by 10% for the year, although natural gas was granted an exception. The government would also begin to monitor American investment in Canada's petroleum industry. Additionally, the price freeze announced in October would eventually have to end, with the price of Canadian oil slowly rising to reach global prices. And finally, the government committed $40 million to oil sands research and promised that Petro-Canada would be heavily involved in developing the oil sands. Ottawa's laundry list of new policies was not very well received in Alberta. The way things had been going with the oil crisis, Albertans would have made a pretty penny off the back of higher oil prices. And to be clear, they still would. But thanks to Trudeau's price freeze and government export tax, their new profits were being cut to subsidize cheaper oil prices for Eastern Canada. This was a divisive issue. Some people, mostly outside of Alberta mind you, thought this was the good neighborly Canadian thing to do, to help out your fellow Canadians when they were in need. Others, like Peter Lougheed, didn't see it that way. Lougheed called the federal export tax the most discriminatory action taken by a federal government against a particular province in the entire history of Confederation. The other issue at play was that yet again, Alberta saw this as an overreach of federal powers into provincial matters. The federal government had granted the province the right to govern its own natural resources in 1930. But now they were coming in with taxes and restrictions left and right without consulting the province. Now technically, the feds had not actually encroached on the province's rights in the way that Albertans had generally perceived it. In Canada, the way that jurisdiction over natural resources is divided can get complicated, and often both the province and federal government share aspects of that jurisdiction. Alberta was responsible for its own natural resources, but the moment those resources crossed a provincial or national border, the federal government was allowed and required to be involved. But regardless of the details and nuance, Premier Lougheed was clear that Alberta would continue exercising control over their oil and gas one way or another, regardless of what Trudeau had in mind. In theory, the oil crisis was great for the oil sands. Increased investments in the oil sands would allow the province to produce even more oil. Even Ottawa recognized that the oil sands were only just starting to contribute meaningfully to the country's oil production. Great Canadian had only been producing oil for 6 years, and with their high startup costs, introducing price controls now would likely kill the company and the industry. Because of this, the feds made the decision to exclude oil sands projects from their price control plans and allowed them to charge full global prices for oil produced from the sands. Additionally, with federal interest in a national oil strategy, tens of millions of dollars were being committed for research and development of the oil sands. But like a child listening to their two divorced parents arguing over who gets custody, the oil sands industry had been watching the whole conflict between Ottawa and Edmonton with a kind of insulted indignation. The feds and the province were busy arguing about who got to reap the profits from the oil sands, and the companies working to make those profits were being sidelined. Now, before you go reaching for your tiny violins, take a look at some numbers. The Great Canadian Oil Sands opened in 1967. In the first 10 years of their operation, they raked in more than $1 billion of revenue. How much of that revenue would you guess was profit for them? 20%? 5%? Well, try less than 0. In their first 6 years, the Great Canadian Oil Sands exclusively lost money due to the insanely high startup costs of building up facilities, technical knowledge, and supply chains to do everything they needed to do. Some of these expenses included building a 20-mile road to the worksite, a $3.3 million bridge crossing the Athabasca River, and a 266-mile pipeline connecting the oil sands to refineries in Edmonton. Even towards the end of their first decade in operation, they had not broken even on the balance sheets. How many companies do you think would be willing to operate at a loss for a decade or more? And that's just looking at their balance sheet starting in 1968, which excludes most of the $250 million they'd invested before opening. Research and development funded by Sun Oil had resulted in 44 of the 69 Canadian patents for oil sand technologies or processes. Simply put, those advancements would not have happened without Sun Oil. When Manly Leonard Natlan proposed nuking the oil sands, he was trying to bypass the long, arduous path of incremental improvements to the existing methods that appeared to be required to turn oil sand extraction into a profitable business. Sun Oil understood that there were no shortcuts on this path, and had managed to make those incremental improvements after decades of hard work and spending. Beginning with the work of Clark and Els, and learning from the failures of Abasand and Bituamount, Sun Oil had built up a foundational understanding of the oil sands on the shoulders of giants. In time, others would come to stand on their shoulders. That is, if they could survive in the short term.
This year, counting both Great Canadian Oil Sands and Syncrude, Canadians will probably receive about 75,000 barrels a day from the tar sands. That's about 4% of Canadian consumption. It's also less than half the amount that was projected 5 years ago, and about 4 times the projected price.
Great Canadian Oil Sands, and now Syncrude as well, had spent massive amounts of capital to develop the oil sands with the intention of turning those losses around in the very long term. But as the provincial and federal governments started increasing royalties and taxes, their investments were staying red for longer. Faced with an economic crisis, the federal and provincial governments were now moving the goalposts for what kind of profits were reasonable for an oil company to make. And it didn't make Alberta an attractive place to invest. It also begged an extremely important question. If American investment in the sands was reduced, could Canadian money possibly fill the gap for oil sands developments to be able to continue? Would Canadian money even be willing to shoulder that kind of risk? Although not in the way he intended, these concerns ended up playing into Trudeau's desire to Canadianize the oil industry, because American companies started packing up and exiting the Canadian market. In a devastating blow to Syncrude, Atlantic Richfield announced in 1974 that they were pulling out, leaving a 30% stake in the oil sands project hanging. To be fair, Lockheed was to blame for this departure too. A big part of Atlantic Richfield's decision to leave was due to the royalty hikes that Alberta's government had introduced under Lockheed. They didn't trust the province or the feds to provide the kind of predictable investment environment for the project to succeed. The Alberta government was left scrambling to find new investors for Atlantic Richfield's stake so the whole project wouldn't collapse. An emergency meeting was held in a Winnipeg hotel room in early 1975. Attendees included representatives from all the industrial partners, Premier Lockheed for Alberta, then President of the Treasury Board and future Prime Minister Jean Chrétien representing the federal government, and even Ontario's Premier Bill Davis. After a 12-hour slog of give and take from all stakeholders, an agreement was finally reached to save the project. Atlantic Richfield's 30% ended up split between the feds and Alberta, as well as Ontario's provincial government. Even Quebec had been offered a piece of the deal, but had turned it down. But the pullback of American petroleum companies in Canada didn't stop at Atlantic Richfield. Sun Oil started to distance themselves from Canadian politics as much as they could. Sun Oil, now rebranded as Sunoco, merged all of their Canadian assets, including the Great Canadian Oil Sands, under the name Suncor. By the mid-90s, Sunoco had sold off all of their ownership of Suncor. Sunoco got out of the mess that was Alberta-Canada relations, but they still held much of the heavy oil refinery capacity in the US that received bitumen from the oil sands, so for them, it was great. Canadian bitumen is sold to the US, refined and upgraded, then sold back to the Canadians at a premium. Why not sell the cow if you can continue to get the milk for free? From that point on, the common approach for American companies to work their way into the oil sands was through their Canadian subsidiaries and spin-offs. If Canada was going to treat American investments as some sort of hostile force, the prevailing perspective for American oil companies was to let the Canadians deal with it themselves as much as possible. Although American investment in Alberta was waning, broadly speaking, interest in the oil sands was only increasing. Syncrude had officially started production in 1978 as a third megaproject proposal came together under the name of Alsands. Similar to Syncrude's consortium structure, Alsands was led by Shell Canada with buy-in from other Canadian companies, including Petro-Canada. They were proposing a $5.1 billion plant that would come online in 1986, capable of producing 137,000 barrels of oil per day, more than the existing capacity of Suncor and Syncrude combined. But perhaps even more promising than Alsands was another project announced by Imperial Oil at Cold Lake. They were planning to build the very first in situ facility, capable of extracting oil from the sands that sat too far below the earth to feasibly mine or dig for. Deeply buried, unminable bitumen accounts for about 80 to 90% of all of Alberta's oil sands. So approving projects and funding technology development for these kinds of projects was incredibly important for the provincial government. The Cold Lake project was forecasting similar daily production numbers to Alsands, and the outlook for the economic development of the oil sands had never been better. But things were not smooth sailing at the end of the 70s for the global oil industry. The Iranian Revolution in 1978 left Iran's oil industry decimated and sent shockwaves through international markets. Global oil prices more than quadrupled from the already high prices that had not recovered at all since 1973. In less than a decade, the world had received a second major shock to the price of oil, and this one was going to hurt at least as badly, if not worse, than the last one. Although things were looking dire for Canada as a whole in the face of the second oil crisis, Alberta was continuing to reap the benefits of higher global oil prices. A drastic shift was underway in the Canadian economy. Alberta was becoming a financial juggernaut within Canada. After decades of struggle to get themselves there, they had very little thanks to give to the rest of the country.
The extraordinary increase in the price of petroleum products has caused the most dramatic reordering of wealth in Canadian history. The New West has become rich, and the Old East, Central Canada, has discovered it's dependent on the vast petroleum resources of the West for its economic well-being. Larry Pratt teaches political science at the University of Alberta. He says in his new book that the oil barons of the New West don't have much use for Eastern Canadian financial interests.
That's a very common attitude that you hear, when the oil industry was booming in the 30s and the 40s, we went to Bay Street, we walked the streets. I mean, I've talked to guys who said they had $100 in their pocket and they went from one finance house and bank in Bay Street to another, looking for capital to try to develop a new well, and were unable to, and finally had to go to New York and sell out part of their company or be taken over. So there's a lot of bitterness. I think it's now become more of a kind of an attitude that, well, now it's our turn. That bitterness is kind of a legacy. It's turned into kind of an attitude in some respects of revenge, I think. But I wouldn't say that's endemic in Calgary. It's just that that's a sentiment that you often run into. And when people say, well, there's too much American ownership here, they'll turn around and they'll say, well, where the hell were you? Where was Bay Street? Where was Montreal when we needed them? Where was the federal government, for that matter?
Around the same time, Pierre Trudeau's 11 years as Prime Minister came to an end when Joe Clark's Conservatives won a minority government in 1979. Fortunately for Trudeau, Clark's government ended up being the shortest in Canadian history. Clark lost a motion of confidence on his government's first budget vote, and Trudeau was elected back with a full majority in the beginning of 1980, just 9 months after the previous election. Clark's short-lived government had planned to bring in some significant changes to both Canada's energy strategy as well as the federal government's relationship with Alberta. Clark's vision for Canada as a community of communities spoke to a system of government where the provinces maintained more control of their own affairs, which differed significantly from Trudeau's centralized federalist approach. As the first born and raised Albertan Prime Minister, the general perception was that Alberta's relationship with Ottawa would improve significantly under Clark, had his government only been able to survive. Clark had also campaigned on reducing federal intervention in Alberta's oil industry by disbanding Petro-Canada. This ended up having significant unintended consequences. Petro-Canada's management had no plan to go gently into that good night, and Clark's clear and vocal intentions to dismantle the company gave them time to react in the form of corporate acquisitions. By purchasing stakes in several high-profile oil projects across the country, Petro-Canada successfully built themselves into one of the largest companies in the industry. At the same time, they had also managed to market themselves as industry leaders and cultivated a strong, influential brand. At a tumultuous time for the industry, in the mind of the Canadian public, Petro-Canada was synonymous with energy stability. Because of this, they managed to put off a trip to the chopping block during Clark's brief tenure. Trudeau was back in power in 1980 with a strong majority in Parliament, but the growing divide in Canada was clear. The Liberals had not won a single seat west of Manitoba. This meant that Western Canada was not represented by the federal ruling party, which was worth concern for the West. Another worry for Alberta was that during the course of his 11 years as Prime Minister, Trudeau had slowly come to the conclusion that there was very little to be gained politically by compromising with the provinces. With a full majority government, which was very likely to be his last, Trudeau was interested in making big, unilateral changes across the Canadian political landscape. He was focused on long-lasting, nation-building projects that would leave a legacy. Things like constitutional independence from Britain, establishing the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and sweeping policies to satisfy the national needs for cheap and reliable energy across Canada. And so, at the end of the 1980s, the National Energy Program was born. The NEP was Trudeau's solution to the energy crises of the 1970s and his vision for the Canadian oil industry in the long haul. In the face of sky-high oil prices for the foreseeable future, the NEP was a push to reduce dependence on foreign oil imports and make Canada energy independent. The core idea behind the National Energy Program was that cheap, reliable access to oil had become a public need rather than a free market commodity. Oil was now so important in daily life, the Liberals thought that it was no longer in Canada's interest to let the free market reign supreme when it came to oil. The feds argued, correctly, that the world price of oil hardly ever reflected the actual cost it took to produce that oil. Rather, the cost was often linked to the difference between world demand and OPEC's willingness to supply that amount. Reducing Canadian dependence on OPEC would eventually help stabilize Canadian prices. To that end, the NEP had three main stated objectives: to increase Canadian participation in the oil and gas industry, to establish fair energy pricing for Canadian consumers, and to secure Canadian oil and gas supplies. At its core, the NEP was a push to nationalize, or at least further Canadianize, a much larger share of the oil and gas industry. By necessity, this meant a reduction in American ownership. This transition would be achieved through several hard-hitting measures. The feds decided that oil discovered before 1979 would be price-fixed at a cheaper rate compared to new oil developments because such a large part of the cost was finding oil reserves in the first place. But the real kicker with this was that by 1980, most of Alberta's oil fields had already been discovered and would be forced into selling their oil at the lower price. The federal government was trying to lure the oil industry into other parts of Canada and away from Alberta. Included in the NEP was also a restriction that barred foreign-owned multinational oil companies from developing new oil fields on Crown land, a privilege only companies with majority Canadian ownership would be granted. As the Fed's sweetheart Crown Corp, the government also planned to buff Petro-Canada even more. Every single new oil and gas development on Crown lands would have to divert a 25% ownership stake to Petro-Canada. Petro-Canada was also going to be awarded a significant chunk of federal funding to start buying out foreign-owned energy companies. To finance this, new taxes were introduced everywhere the government could think to put them. A new tax on natural gas exports was proposed. The proposed petroleum and gas revenue tax would tax oil as it left the ground at the well. Refineries would be taxed with a Canadian ownership charge. Even consumers at the pump would be taxed more in the grand effort to further nationalize the industry. The National Energy Program was a conservative's nightmare. It was a massive expansion of federal oversight, spending would skyrocket, and would result in massive tax increases to businesses and consumers alike. Investors did not take the news of the NEP well. Within 2 days of the program's announcement, the oil and gas index on the Toronto Stock Exchange dropped by 16%, representing $2.3 billion of investment capital that was now just gone. shares in Canadian oil companies were selling so quickly that several were suspended from trading. The reaction from Alberta to the NEP was furious across the board. The front page of the Calgary Herald the day after the announcement painted it as a disaster for the province. Alberta was used to the feds overreaching, but the feeling was that this proposal would rip up the foundation of Alberta's economy and destroy their newfound wealth. As Premier Lougheed put it, "I think what's happened is that the Ottawa government has, without negotiation, without agreement, simply walked into our home and occupied the living room." But not every response from Alberta was so mild-mannered. On the less civil side of things, you have Calgary's Mayor Ralph Klein. He thought that Alberta should turn off the tap on all pipelines sending oil to eastern Canada in retaliation. Klein wanted to, and I quote, "let the eastern bastards freeze in the dark." The irony in the modern context here is massive, considering the winter this year in Alberta and the struggle they're having to keep their own homes heated. But Klein's attitude resonated with Albertans. It's no wonder his slogan ended up on the bumpers of cars all around Western Canada. And it makes you realize just how effective the Trudeaus have been at influencing how Albertans decorate their cars. The aspect of price controls in the NEP was a significant concern for Alberta's oil industry. Price controls inherently limited profits, and many oil companies were looking to balance their books and grow their businesses coming out of the already heavily price-controlled market of the 1970s. Now, these were the before and after dates for conventional producers. For the oil sands, that discovery date was set at 1974. Oil sands projects before the state would have to charge the lower price and therefore rake in lower profits. Thing is, there were only 2 oil sands projects up and running, and this change only impacted one of them. Suncor, who had only just started making a profit year over year, were projecting a $13 million net annual loss under the price controls of the NEP. Meanwhile, the feds had decided that Syncrude was eligible for exemption from the new pricing regime and could charge full world price for their oil. The optics on this were laughably bad, given the fact that the feds owned a minority stake in the oil sands project that came out on top under these price control rules. Lougheed's provincial government was unwilling to accept the NEP as presented, and their response was a threefold threat to Ottawa. First, Alberta would challenge the federal government's newly imposed natural gas export tax in court, which they believed they had a good legal argument to win. Second, Alberta would begin reducing its sale of petroleum to the rest of the country by 15%, or 180,000 barrels per day over the course of 9 months. Not as much as Ralph wanted, but the eastern bastards might have to put their sweaters on. Lastly, the province would put on hold the Al Sands and Cold Lake projects. The federal government desperately needed these projects to start as soon as possible in order to build up the oil production base to meet the country's projected demand for self-sufficiency. This would hurt Alberta too, but Alberta was gearing up for a war of attrition. The borderline hostile tax climate in Canada by 1981 led to a predictable outcome for the oil sands. It was not a good place for businesses to invest. Suncor and Syncrude were safe for the time being. They were far enough into their life cycles to be worth maintaining in their current states. But one by one, major players started pulling out from upcoming oil sand developments. Imperial Oil indefinitely delayed the Cold Lake in situ project. Syncrude canceled a planned expansion to their facility. But the biggest blow was the implosion of Al Sands. Partially due to the second oil shock, a recession in 1980 drove inflation and interest rates through the roof. Just a couple of years after Al Sands was announced, cost estimates for the project had more than doubled to $13 billion. This was a price the consortium was just not willing to pay. Edmonton and Ottawa were caught completely off guard. In the midst of their back and forth fighting over royalties and jurisdiction, and with the province using Al Sands as their pawn in negotiations with the feds, neither government had anticipated that such a large consortium would come crumbling down. At the last minute, both governments scrambled to sweeten the deal to keep the private sector partners on the project. Their last offer included a postponement of royalties, guaranteed loans, and even promised that the government would foot 50% of the cost for the project. But one by one, every company in the consortium dropped out. The Canadianization of the oil industry was planned to be a cleaning of house, but ended up bulldozing the neighborhood. But bad fortune for Trudeau's government didn't stop there. In 1981, something happened that no one expected was possible. The global price of oil started to go down. The NEP was built on one absolutely critical foundation: the assumption that the price of oil would continue to increase, or at least stay high, throughout the 1980s and into the distant future. All of Trudeau's plans could only be achieved if there was no more cheap oil for Canada to import. But due to high inflation in the late 70s and early 80s, as well as decreases to the nominal dollar amount for a barrel of oil, the conditions deemed necessary for the NEP to succeed had evaporated. These economic conditions led to a recession for the oil industry, as well as the global economy in general. Contrary to what some folks in Alberta might tell you, this downturn in itself was not Trudeau or the NEP's fault. These economic conditions were being experienced across the world at this time, and as much power as a Canadian Prime Minister has, it's not enough to cause the price of oil to drop that much. Nor would Trudeau have even wanted that outcome. The real problem with the NEP was that on a deep, fundamental level, the relationship between Ottawa and Alberta had fractured. Alberta has always been fairly conservative, and it's no surprise they weren't buddy-buddy with a Liberal Prime Minister or government. But the perception in Alberta was that Ottawa felt that they had more of a right to Alberta's wealth than Alberta did themselves, and Alberta resented that. Out of the ashes of the National Energy Program came a strong sentiment in Alberta, as well as the other western provinces, that they were not being treated equally to the rest of Canada's eastern provinces. That feeling of Western alienation eventually manifested itself politically as the Reform Party of Canada. The party was founded in 1987 by Preston Manning, the son of former Premier Ernest Manning. The Reform Party wasn't explicitly or even implicitly interested in separating or seceding from the country. Rather, it was meant to be a party to give voters in Western Canada a more regional voice in Parliament. With the formation of the Bloc Québécois a few years later, this was a rather divisive time in Canadian politics. After more than a decade of centralized economic nationalism coming top-down from Ottawa, regional parties were popping up trying to get more control over their own parts of the country. But this wasn't a change isolated to Canada. With the 1980s came a global wave of populist conservatism and criticism of big government through the likes of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. This wave of the New Right landed on Canada's front step in 1984. Pierre Trudeau's nearly 16 years as Prime Minister came to an end with the election of Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservatives. Mulroney's primary concern was the national economy. High inflation and unemployment were straining consumers and businesses alike, and the Canadian dollar was dropping in value against the American. To spur economic growth and investment, the main tools in Mulroney's playbook were deregulation, privatization, and limited government intervention. But on their own, they wouldn't guarantee success in the long term. For Mulroney, that long-term success was an expanding trade with the United States. In 1982, 70% of Canadian imports came from the US. The same percent of Canada's exports also went to the US. The path that the Progressive Conservatives saw to financial prosperity was with stronger economic ties to the United States. And the best vehicle for that was a bilateral free trade agreement. The federal election in 1988 became a single-issue election on whether or not Canada should enter a free trade agreement with the United States. A vote for the Conservatives was yes, a vote for the Liberals was no. If the majority that Mulroney won was any indication, it was overwhelmingly what the Canadian public wanted. One of the most controversial aspects to the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was the so-called Energy Proportionality Clause. Under this part of the agreement, Canada was required to maintain a constant ratio of energy exports to domestic energy production. In other words, if Canada ever wanted to decrease the amount of oil they sold to the US, the only way they were legally allowed to do this was by reducing their own fossil fuel production. This also meant that if Canada didn't have enough fuel to meet their own domestic needs, they would still be forced into providing the same proportion of their production over to the United States. This was a lot of power for the US to have over the Canadian energy market. Granted, this clause went both ways and was meant to protect the US from quickly losing access to oil like they did with OPEC in the 70s. But when Mexico was added onto the agreement in the form of the North American Free Trade Agreement, this was not a condition that Mexico was subjected to, just Canada. This was seen by many as one of the great weaknesses of NAFTA for Canada. Canadian oil and gas had almost become common property with the United States. In line with his small government ideals, Mulroney never used Petro-Canada as a policy tool. By 1990, Mulroney's government announced their intention to privatize Petro-Canada, and public shares in the company started selling a year later. In 2009, Suncor Energy announced that they would be acquiring Petro-Canada to the tune of $21 billion. This merger with Petro-Canada made Suncor the second largest company in the country, and solidified Suncor as the dominant Canadian producer of crude oil from the oil sands. Almost every oil-related policy from the Trudeau years was swiftly cancelled, dismantled, or warped beyond recognition. Mulroney's government introduced the Western Accord on Energy in 1985. This program scrapped most of the NEP. Price regulations and restrictions on imports and exports were done. The complex system of taxes the Liberals had proposed was eliminated. Petro-Canada was sold off. Even the tangible infrastructure that was built under Trudeau was not immune. As US demand increased through the 1990s, the newest portion of the Enbridge pipeline from Sarnia to Montreal was repurposed in 1999. Instead of bringing Western oil east, the direction of flow was reversed to bring imported and offshore Canadian oil to Ontario refineries. More than 20 years of strict regulation and protectionism in the Canadian oil industry had come to an end, and for better or worse, Canada was embracing free market trade with the United States with open arms. Love him or hate him, Pierre Trudeau was one of Canada's most influential and impactful prime ministers. Trudeau achieved plenty of victories as prime minister, but when you're running the country for a decade and a half, you're bound to mark down at least a few failures as well. But it was the collapse of the National Energy Program and the resulting Western alienation that was Pierre Trudeau's biggest failure when it came to the country as a whole. The end of the NEP marked a turning point in the relationship between Alberta and Canada. What was intended as a lifeboat for Eastern Canada in an economic crisis was perceived as a robbery in the West, and Alberta has had their guard up ever since. The struggle between Ottawa and the province over resource rights is ingrained in the province's collective memory. Some will tell you the issue is settled, and history has shown that this is a fight the provinces have clearly and unequivocally won. But at the same time, there is a perception in Western Canada that history is currently repeating itself. The fact of the matter is that the current federal government is again pushing for changes to how the fossil fuel industry in Canada operates through policies like the carbon tax. Of all people, leading that charge is Pierre Trudeau's son, Justin Trudeau. And old grudges die hard. Just last year, Alberta's current Premier Danielle Smith said that Pierre Trudeau just wanted to steal our wealth, while Justin Trudeau, on the other hand, wants to extinguish it. This is the legacy of Pierre Trudeau in Alberta. His tenure spanned 4 governments, 3 decades, 2 oil crises, and yet in Alberta, Pierre Trudeau is still to this day remembered as one thing: the Laurentian elite who tried to steal Alberta's oil. But of course, this is not the end of the story of the oil sands. As the 20th century came to an end, 3 things happened in the oil sands that no one imagined would ever be possible. The first was that the price of oil was going to go up again, meaning the oil sands would become as important as ever to the Canadian economy. Second was just how much the oil sands industry was capable of growing to meet the demands of the 21st century. And third, Alberta was poisoning itself and the country, and there was almost nothing that could be done to stop it.